I grew up hearing about the not deer. If you're listening from somewhere in these mountains, drop your location in the comments. I want to know who else knows what I'm talking about. I was 19 years old, driving home from a closing shift at the diner in Boone. It was February, late, maybe 1:30 in the morning, and the road I took was a 2-lane blacktop that threaded through Watauga County like a scar. No streetlights, no houses for miles. Just the tunnel of my headlights cutting through the dark and the bare trees pressing in on both sides like they were listening. I'd driven that road 100 times. I knew every curve, every pothole, every place where the fog pooled in the low spots and made the world disappear. I wasn't afraid of it. You grow up in these mountains, you learn that the dark is just part of the landscape. It's not something to fear, it's something to respect. But that night, something was different. I was about 10 miles from home when I saw it standing on the shoulder, just at the edge of where my headlights reached. At first glance, it looked like a deer. A big one, maybe a buck, judging by the size. It was facing the road, its body angled toward me, and it didn't move when the light hit it. Deer freeze sometimes, everybody knows that. You come around a corner and there's a doe standing in the middle of the road, eyes wide, legs locked, waiting to see if you're a threat or just passing through. It's not unusual. I slowed down, expecting it to bolt. It didn't. I got closer, maybe 30 yards, and that's when I started to notice the details, the things that didn't fit. Its legs were too long, not slightly too long, not the kind of thing you'd second guess. They were wrong. Each leg looked like it had an extra joint, a bend in the middle that made the whole structure seem unstable, like a chair built by someone who'd only heard a description of a chair and never seen one. The legs didn't bend the way a deer's legs bend. They bent backward, then forward, then backward again, creating a shape that made my brain stutter trying to process it. The body was gaunt, ribs visible through the hide, spine a sharp ridge running from shoulders to tail. But the hide itself was stretched too tight, like someone had taken a deer's skin and pulled it over a frame that was slightly too large, slightly too angular. The neck was too long, curved in a way that reminded me of a snake more than a mammal. And the head was facing me, fully facing me. Not the way a deer turns its head to look at you. This thing's entire skull was rotated so that its face pointed directly forward, the way a human's face points forward. Predator eyes, forward-facing, and the expression, if you could call it that, was wrong. The mouth was slightly open, and I could see teeth. Too many teeth. Small, white, uniform, like rows of seeds. I stopped the truck. I don't know why. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive, to gun it, to get past this thing and never look back. But I stopped. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and my foot on the brake, and I stared at it through the windshield. It stared back. Then it smiled. I don't mean it bared its teeth or snarled or did anything that a normal animal might do. I mean it smiled. The corners of its mouth pulled back in a slow, deliberate motion, widening into a grin that showed every one of those too many teeth. Its eyes didn't blink. They stayed locked on me, wide and dark and empty, and the grin just kept spreading until the face looked like it was going to split in half. I felt my stomach drop. Not fear, not yet. Just a deep cellular wrongness, the kind of feeling you get when you see something that shouldn't exist, and your brain refuses to file it under any category it knows. The thing took a step toward the truck. Not a normal step. Its front leg lifted, bent at that impossible joint, and set down again with a movement that was too fluid, too smooth. It looked like stop motion, like someone was moving it frame by frame and I was only seeing every third frame. I hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, both hands locked on the wheel, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I drove the remaining 10 miles home without slowing down, without stopping, without breathing more than I had to. When I pulled into my driveway, I finally looked in the mirror. The road behind me was empty, but on my rear window, pressed into the thin layer of frost that had formed while I'd been parked, there was a print. Not a handprint, not an animal print, something in between. 4 long, thin impressions radiating out from a central point, like fingers, but wrong. Too long. Too many joints. I went inside. I locked the door. I didn't tell anyone. The next morning, I drove that same road in daylight. I wanted to see the spot where I'd stopped, where the thing had been standing. I wanted proof that I hadn't imagined it, that the exhaustion in the dark and the long shift hadn't conspired to create something that wasn't there. I found the spot. I recognized the curve, the tree line, the exact place where I'd hit the brakes. I pulled over and got out. The shoulder was covered in frost, and in that frost, clear as anything, were tracks. They started at the tree line and moved toward the road in a straight line. Not a deer's gait, not the 4-print pattern of a walking animal. These were 2 prints. Left, right, bipedal. Each print was elongated, narrow, with 4 long toe impressions at the front and a deep heel mark at the back. They walked to the edge of the asphalt, and then they stopped. No prints leading away, no disturbance in the frost beyond that point. Just the 2-footed trail ending at the road, as if whatever made them had stepped onto the blacktop and ceased to exist. I don't drive that road at night anymore. I take the long way home, the route that adds 20 minutes and keeps me closer to town. And when people ask me why, I tell them the truth. I tell them I saw something that looked like a deer, and they nod because they know. In these mountains, we all know. There are things that live in the hollows and the high places, things that learned a long time ago how to wear shapes that almost look right, how to stand at the edge of the light and wait for you to slow down, to stop, to look a little closer. And if you give them that moment of attention, they smile, because they know you've seen them. And once you've seen them, they've seen you too. I still check my rear window every morning before I drive. I still look for prints in the frost. And some nights, when the house is quiet and the mountain is dark, I hear something walking past my window. 2 legs, slow and patient. I don't open the curtains anymore. My grandmother told me never to whistle at night in the mountains. If you're from Appalachia, you know this rule. Comment below if your grandparents told you the same thing. I was 16 when I broke the rule. Not out of defiance or rebellion, just out of forgetting. That's the thing about rules passed down by old mountain people. They sound like superstition until the moment you learn they're not. It was February, and I was staying at my uncle's cabin in Robin County, Georgia, deep in the Chattahoochee National Forest. My parents had sent me there for a long weekend, the kind of family favor that gets arranged when a kid needs to be separated from bad influences back home. I wasn't thrilled about it, but the cabin had no cell service and no Wi-Fi, which meant I'd brought books and a flashlight and resigned myself to 3 days of boredom. My uncle, James, was in his 60s and had lived in those mountains his entire life. He was the kind of man who spoke in full paragraphs only when he had something worth saying, and the rest of the time communicated in nods and grunts and the occasional dry observation delivered without a smile. He knew every ridge, every creek, every animal track, and every story worth knowing about the land around his cabin. On the second night after dinner, he went out to the shed to split kindling for the stove. I stayed inside, sitting by the window with a book I wasn't really reading, looking out at the dark tree line. The forest at night in winter is a specific kind of empty. No leaves to rustle, no insects, just the bare bones of the trees and the cold pressing in from every direction. I started whistling. I don't even remember what tune. Something I'd heard on the radio maybe. Just a low, idle whistle to fill the silence. I got through maybe 4 or 5 notes before my uncle's voice cut through the dark from outside. "Stop." It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it had a weight to it that made me freeze mid-breath. He came back inside a minute later, set the kindling by the stove, and sat down across from me. He didn't look at me right away. He just stared at the stove, his hands resting on his knees, his jaw working like he was chewing over what to say. "You don't whistle at night in these mountains," he said finally. "Not after dark. Not ever." I asked him why. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me. He said that when he was a boy, maybe 10 years old, he'd been walking home from a neighbor's house after sunset. It was winter, and the path cut through a stretch of woods that ran along the base of a ridge. He'd been whistling the whole way, some song his mother used to sing, and he didn't think anything of it. Halfway through the woods, something whistled back. It came from up on the ridge, maybe 100 yards away. The same tune, the same rhythm. Note for note, perfectly matched. He stopped walking, he stopped whistling, he stood there on the path, listening. The whistling continued. It was moving, not toward him, not away from him, parallel. It stayed on the ridge, keeping pace with him, repeating the tune over and over, getting louder with each repetition. Then it changed. The melody stayed the same, but the voice behind it shifted. It went from sounding distant to sounding close, from sounding human to sounding like something that was imitating a human without quite understanding the mechanics. The pitch was wrong. The breath behind it was wrong. It sounded wet, strained, like air being forced through something that wasn't built for it. My uncle ran. He told me he ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, and the whistling followed him the whole way, staying on the ridge, matching his speed, never getting closer, never falling behind. It followed him all the way to the edge of his family's property, and then it stopped. He made it home. He didn't tell his parents. He didn't tell anyone for years. But from that night on, he never whistled outside after dark. And when he had kids of his own, he taught them the same rule. He looked at me then, his eyes flat and serious in the firelight. "Something out there listens," he said, "and when it hears you, it answers. And once it answers, it knows where you are." I didn't whistle again that weekend. I went to bed that night with his words sitting in my chest like a stone, and I lay there in the dark, listening to the cabin settle, listening to the wind, listening for anything that sounded like a tune I recognized. I didn't hear anything, not that night, but on the third night, my last night at the cabin, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of whistling outside. It was faint at first, distant, coming from somewhere up on the ridge behind the cabin. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart already starting to move faster than it should. The tune was familiar. It took me a few seconds to place it, and when I did, my blood went cold. It was the tune I'd been whistling 2 nights before, the one I'd only gotten 4 or 5 notes into before my uncle stopped me, the one I'd never finished. But whatever was out there on the ridge had finished it. It was whistling the whole melody, start to end, over and over, with a precision that felt rehearsed. I got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was out, half full, and the ridge was visible as a dark line against the sky. I couldn't see anything moving, just the trees, still and skeletal, and the snow on the ground catching the pale light. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It had texture, weight. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard footsteps. Not on the ridge, closer, right outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. They moved from the tree line toward the cabin, stopping just outside my window. I couldn't see anything. The window was above my head, and I'd have to stand on the bed to look out. But I could feel it. I could feel something standing there, just on the other side of the glass, close enough that if the wall wasn't between us, I could reach out and touch it. The whistling started again, right outside my window, so close I could hear the breath behind it, wet and labored, like someone whistling through a mouthful of water. It was the same tune, my tune, repeated perfectly, note for note, as if whatever was out there had memorized it and was offering it back to me as a gift or a challenge. I didn't move. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, my knees pulled to my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow pulls, and I waited. The whistling went on for maybe 5 minutes. Then it stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away from the window, back toward the tree line, slow and unhurried. I heard them crunch through the snow, growing fainter, until they were gone entirely. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on that bed until the sky went gray, and my uncle knocked on my door to tell me breakfast was ready. I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I didn't tell anyone. But before I left that morning, I asked him one more question. I asked him what happens if you whistle back. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "I don't know, and I don't want to find out." I left the cabin that afternoon. My parents picked me up, and I went back to my life, back to school, back to the flatland world where the rules are different and the dark doesn't listen. But I've never whistled at night since. Not outside. Not even inside, if I'm being honest, because some part of me knows that it's still out there, somewhere on a ridge in Rabun County, walking through the winter woods with a tune in its head that it learned from me. And if I whistle again, it'll hear me. No matter how far away I am, no matter how many years have passed, it'll hear me, and it'll answer. And this time, it might not stay on the ridge. I used to think my grandfather was just a superstitious old man. Drop a comment if you've ever found stone stacks in the woods. I need to know I'm not the only one who's seen them. My grandfather lived alone in a farmhouse at the end of a valley in McDowell County, North Carolina. The house was old, built sometime in the 1940s, with a tin roof and a porch that sagged on one side from a century of mountain winters. Behind the house, the land rose steeply into a ridge covered in laurel thickets and oak trees that had been growing there longer than anyone could remember. I spent summers there as a kid, back when my parents were still together, and sending me away for a few weeks seemed like a reasonable solution to whatever arguments were tearing through our house. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. I liked my grandfather, who taught me how to fish and split wood and read the weather by watching the sky. But there was one rule he gave me that I never understood until it was too late. "Don't go past the laurel thicket," he'd say, "and if you see stacks of stones, you walk the other way. You don't touch them. You don't knock them over. You leave them exactly as you found them." I asked him why once. He just shook his head and said, "Because some things aren't ours to disturb." That was all I got. And because I was 12 and thought I knew better, I didn't take it seriously. It was the 3rd week of February when I broke the rule. I'd been at the farmhouse for 4 days, and the weather had been brutal. Cold rain, sleet, the kind of gray, wet misery that makes you feel like the sun has been permanently turned off. I'd been stuck inside reading the same 3 books I'd brought, playing solitaire with a deck of cards so worn the faces were almost blank, and staring out the window at the rain. On the 5th day, the weather broke. The sky cleared, the temperature rose into the 40s, and my grandfather told me I could go outside as long as I stayed within sight of the house. I lasted about an hour before I got bored. The laurel thicket started about 200 yards behind the house, a dense tangle of branches and waxy green leaves that stayed thick even in winter. It created a natural wall between the farmhouse and the ridge above, and I'd never gone past it, not because I was afraid, but because I'd never had a reason to. That day, I decided I wanted to see what was on the other side. I pushed through the thicket, the branches scraping against my coat, the ground soft and muddy under my boots. It took about 5 minutes to get through, and when I came out the other side, I found myself in a clearing. It was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded on all sides by trees. The ground was covered in dead leaves and moss, and in the center of the clearing, there were stacks, stone stacks, maybe a dozen of them, scattered across the clearing in no pattern I could recognize. Each stack was made of flat river stones, carefully balanced one on top of the other, rising anywhere from a foot to 3 feet high. They looked deliberate, intentional, like someone had spent hours building them. But the strange thing was how old they looked. The stones were covered in moss and lichen, darkened by weather and time. Some of the stacks had toppled, their stones lying in piles on the ground, but most were still standing, perfectly balanced, unmoved by wind or rain or the passage of years. I stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at them. I knew I should leave. I could hear my grandfather's voice in my head, clear and firm. "You don't touch them. You leave them exactly as you found them." But I was 12, and 12-year-olds are curious in ways that override good sense. I walked to the nearest stack, a small one made of 5 stones. I reached out and touched the top stone. It was cold and rough under my fingers. I picked it up, felt the weight of it, and then set it back down. Nothing happened. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and almost laughed at myself. It was just rocks. Old rocks, sure, but rocks. My grandfather was just being superstitious. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A sound from the trees. Not from one direction, but from all around the clearing. A low, rhythmic clicking, like stones being tapped together. Slow at first, then faster, then overlapping, until it sounded like a dozen invisible hands were knocking rocks in a pattern I couldn't follow. I froze. The clicking continued, surrounding me, coming from the trees, from the ground, from the air itself. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no birds, no distant sounds of the valley below. Just stillness, so complete it felt like I'd been sealed inside something. I ran. I crashed back through the laurel thicket, branches whipping my face, my boots sliding in the mud. I didn't stop until I reached the farmhouse, didn't slow down until I was on the porch with the door closed behind me and my grandfather staring at me from his chair by the stove. "You went past the thicket," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out toward the ridge. "Did you touch them?" I hesitated. Then I nodded again. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in my life, I saw something on my grandfather's face that I'd never seen before. Fear. "Go to your room," he said quietly. "Don't come out until I tell you." I did what he said. I went upstairs to the small bedroom at the back of the house, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that looked out over the valley. I sat on the bed and waited. An hour passed, then 2. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of floorboards as my grandfather moved around downstairs. I pressed my ear to the door, but I couldn't hear what he was doing. Then, just as the sun started to go down, I heard it again. The clicking. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere outside, but it was getting closer. I went to the window and looked out. The clearing was visible from my window, a pale gap in the trees about halfway up the ridge. And standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line, were figures. I couldn't see them clearly. The distance was too great, and the light was fading. But they were there, tall, thin shapes, standing motionless among the trees, facing the house. And they were holding stones. I watched them raise the stones and tap them together. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound carried down the ridge and through the window, clear and deliberate. Then they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. My grandfather came upstairs a few minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on my shoulder. "They'll leave by morning," he said. "As long as you stay inside. As long as you don't go back." I didn't ask who they were. I didn't want to know. That night, I heard the clicking again. It circled the house, slow and patient, moving from window to window. I heard footsteps on the porch. I heard something scrape against the siding. I heard my grandfather downstairs, sitting by the stove, not moving, not reacting, just waiting. By dawn, the sounds were gone. My grandfather drove me home the next day. He didn't explain. He didn't lecture. He just told me very quietly that some places in these mountains belong to things that were here long before we were. And the stacks are markers, boundaries, warnings. You crossed one, he said, and they let you leave. That doesn't happen twice. I'm 34 now. My grandfather passed away 6 years ago, and the farmhouse was sold to a family from Florida who turned it into a vacation rental. I drove past it last year, and I saw that they'd cleared the laurel thicket. They'd opened up the ridge, built a fire pit, and put in a hiking trail. And in the photos on their rental listing, I saw the clearing. The stacks are still there. More of them now. Taller, closer to the house. I thought about calling them, thought about warning them. But what would I say? That they've built their fire pit in a place they shouldn't have. That something in those woods has been marking that ground for longer than any of us have been alive? They wouldn't believe me. And maybe they don't need to. Maybe they'll follow the same rules I didn't. Maybe they'll see the stacks and leave them alone. Or maybe one February night, they'll hear the clicking, and they'll look out their window and see the figures standing at the edge of the trees, holding stones, tapping them together in a rhythm that sounds almost like a language. And they'll learn what my grandfather tried to teach me. Some things in these mountains aren't ours to touch, and the markers they leave aren't decorations. They're warnings,